Just with issues around immigration, it comes up as well. Because in talking about how the world is different, my students uniformly see it as a positive thing that there's more security, which always, just me being who I am and my own sensibilities, and sort of just like, well, now there's these guys with guns in the Penn Station, and I'm being, you know, I'm taking off my shoes and I'm doing all of this. But see it as a good thing, and so there's an area where we get to have sort of these conversations. In a school where there's so many different cultures and backgrounds and languages and experiences and personal stories, it becomes a place too to talk about diversity and respect. I don't know, listening to so many other people and everything this morning, whether or not sort of I'll revisit this. We sort of move along these, you know, like the informal title of my class is sort of people, power, and culture, and just sort of an American studies class, right, as broad as that can be, but just some of the most basic elements of life in the United States is so brand new. But coming back to do a more sort of formal study seems worthwhile, but it is currently at this moment just the way in which we start a dialogue about why we do what we do and should we be doing this, and setting up some of the norms in the class of critical thinking, of questioning, of that there's no right or wrong necessarily, but there's a dialogue that has to start happening in my classroom and around certain issues.
Hi, I'm Bram Hoebel. I teach modern world history and AP world history and in a modern Middle Eastern history class at Friends Seminary here in the city. And this subject, it comes up in multiple classes, but I'm going to focus a little more on sort of how I approach this in my 10th grade classes on modern world history. And this is a really sort of vital subject for us, all the reasons people have talked about. But for me personally, teaching this, my first year at Friends was actually 2001. It was the second day of school. And this was my sort of, in a way, almost introduction to the culture of teaching in a Quaker school. Watching the response of the other faculty, you know, so many of the students really sort of shaped, has left this sort of mark in my mind about how to think and deal with this subject. And so in my second year at Friends was when I began teaching 10th grade world, and I really sort of came at it with that in the back of my mind from the very start. For those of you who aren't familiar with teaching in a Quaker school or anything about Quaker schools, it's really sort of different at times than other public schools and then other independent schools. We have a really clear mission and a really clear vision of what we're supposed to be doing, and it really provides an incredible framework for the study of history. When things like peace, simplicity, equality, diversity are true parts of the school's mission, it filters into how you would deal with subjects in class. And in particularly for history, getting into anything with wars, it's always a sort of focus more on what were the causes of the war, how did the war affect civilians, and what were sort of the outcomes of wars. It's never really about military tactics or battles. And so I just wanted to give you a little context of how I come at this, because I think, you know, some of the people have been mentioning how much context is important for understanding these events. Well, it also helps to sort of understand my approach a little. So in my 10th grade class, I use a couple different books, one of which is Robert Mark's The Origins of the Modern World, and there was some mention about how little textbooks talk about this or how they talk about this. This book was published in 2002, and it begins actually with 9/11. And so it's always been great that it helps frame this right from the start of the year. And so I start off the year with a discussion with students thinking about that event, but also about the world that we live in. What is it? How is it shaped? Trying to get their impressions. And so it's not just simply, oh, why did 9/11 happen? I actually, each year, start off with usually a really popular song that I travel a lot and have heard around the world. So imagine within the space of 5 minutes of talking about 9/11, then jumping to Carly Rae Jepsen's Call Me Maybe. And why did I hear that in small parts of Indonesia, small towns in Indonesia or in Jordan? And I want students to be thinking a bit about globalization as a larger process and where 9/11 fits into that. And so it also, I've realized, takes away that it's not just, oh, we're going to try to make sense of these really awful things as historians. We're going to try to make sense of some fun things that teenagers care a lot about. And so that's been one aspect of how I've sort of tried to frame a discussion of this. It's part of a broader project of making sense of the world from a historical perspective. The other important thing is the language we use. And this came up in the morning a little bit about, terrorism or freedom fighter, or those sorts of things. I'm really careful in everything that I give the students to use words that have as little baggage attached to them. I never actually will use the word terrorism in class. I will talk about the use of violence against civilians to try to achieve political ends. And I know it's wordy, but it's also really important to try to sort of, terrorism is such a loaded word, and as soon as you mention it, it shapes how we frame it. And I do this for lots of things, not just for terrorism, but that's a big part of what I try to do in the classroom. We're talking about this, is to teach students that these words are out there. Part of a historical approach is trying to step back a little bit to look at this in a more nuanced way. Now, in terms of the class, so my class, when I say modern world, most people might not think of this as modern world history. I begin in 1200 and go to the present. I start with the Mongols, and I essentially end with McDonald's, is the joke that I always say. And I want the students to understand this global process of how our world came to be in a truly global format. Trying to think about a shift from empires to nation states and the rise of nationalism. Trying to think about the creation of the global economy and how it works. And so that is the bigger context. When we get to the 20th century, this is basically right after spring break. In private schools, we have it at the end of March. And so April and May are, let's understand the 20th century. 8 weeks, that's all I got. And I'm adamant that I am going to get to the present. That is the goal for me, more than anything as a teacher, that I won't be one of those history teachers who stops in the 60s, or the joke about American teachers who can't get past the Civil War, those sorts of things. History is really about getting to the present. So what that means is before they get to 9/11, there's a few things that they have in terms of context for the event. They've learned about the development of nationalism and how that can play out. They've been thinking about rivalries between states in the 20th century. And so thinking about World War I, World War II, and the Cold War. And this is an important part, I've realized, because when you then focus on U.S. policy, the United States isn't the only country that has sort of had ambitions to try to influence other parts of the world. They see 5 other countries that have been doing that as well, quite clearly. Okay, and so that they have a little sense that I'm not just picking on the U.S. or something. Then when we get into the Cold War and more recent 20th century history, all right, they are able to see this in a slightly broader global context. One of the things that I do, I have a lesson called Why the Cold War Was Hot, why we sort of use that term Cold War, but what it's masking, all of this conflict in the world, and really having them see how the U.S. is involved in many places, as was the Soviet Union. Okay, and so you have that out there, and obviously Afghanistan comes up in that context. You then have a couple days where we're looking at the end of the Cold War and the rise of the United States as the lone superpower in the world in the New World Order. And so we talk about U.S. military bases around the world. They look at maps and they see how extensive they are. They also see where they're concentrated more as well. They talk about arms race. We talk about arms trade and these sorts of things. So they have that as a context in terms of some of U.S. policies and what our country does. And then the last 2 ones are really sort of key, is we talk a lot about the neoliberal economic order. What does that mean? Okay, how does that work for the whole world? And how does that affect individuals? What is the effect of our particular global economic system, all right, and especially on creating gaps in terms of rich and poor and how that plays out for people. And then right before 9/11, as we're looking at some of the broader social trends of the 20th century, we talk about the religious patterns, all right, the sort of flourishing of secularism in the first half, and then, for lack of a better term, the rise of fundamentalism as one of the sort of trends in global religion in the second half of the 20th century. And so they see it on a global scale, all right, that there is an increased religiosity in many parts of the world. And so when we talk about Islamism, it's again not sort of unique. We obviously talk about that as to help us before we jump into bin Laden, but you see it in this broader context. Now, all of that is the background to then the really direct treatment of 9/11. And so what I do after all of this, and this is literally usually like the penultimate week of the year, I give them a copy of Osama bin Laden's Declaration of Jihad against the United States. It comes from the Bruce Lawrence book that Zach Lockman showed before. I edited it down a little, and it's basically 2 pages, what they're looking at. And you begin with the normal sort of prologue about, I understand the difficulty of reading this, I don't just toss it to the students. But they read it, and then I sort of let them pause for a moment, and beginning of class, we ask to sort of reflect, and this is the great thing about being in a Quaker school. Students are great at reflection, okay? And then the first question I'll ask them is, what are bin Laden's reasons for his opposition to the United States? And I'm trying to phrase it in as neutral of a language as possible. And when they start answering, I ask them to try to do the same thing. Okay, try not to use direct quotes. Try to take what he's saying and identify the specific reasons. And what you realize, how many of you actually have read this particular source?
I have, thanks to you.
Has anyone else? A few people have. I really encourage people. This is an incredible source to look at.
Yeah.
And what you realize is there's essentially 3 reasons. And they're all political reasons. One is he's opposed, okay, to the U.S. building military bases in the Gulf region, specifically in Saudi Arabia. He's opposed to U.S. policy against Iraq in the 1990s. I mean, think about it. This source is from 1997. You have to put yourself back in the period of the sanctions and of the first Gulf War. So he's opposed to U.S. policy in Iraq, and he's opposed to U.S. support of Israel against Palestinians. And the students are able to sort of do this. We write it up on the board together, and then I ask them to, what do you notice about his reasons? And after a little bit of discussion, they realize he's opposed to U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East. And again, trying to get to sort of some neutral language there. And once we have that, I ask them, well, what do you think? And you get a whole range of responses. And we sort of work through that. And then I indulge the question that they're sort of begging at, why do you think he uses the language that he uses in this source? All right, it's an incredibly inflammatory speech. All right, it's loaded with lots of religious rhetoric, particularly Islamic religious rhetoric. I asked them to try to start to unpack the language a bit. And then they're able to sort of hopefully compartmentalize the specific reasons for his opposition with a bit of the way in which he frames those reasons. And so that's the first part. Then we will look at a speech by George Bush from September, I think it's 19th or 20th of 2001. And the gist of this speech, in many things, but I have it here that the students often come to, Americans are asking, why do they, the terrorists, hate us? They hate what we see right here in this chamber, a democratically elected government. Their leaders are self-appointed. They hate our freedoms, our freedom of religion, our freedom of speech, our freedom to vote and assemble and disagree with each other. And I asked the students to think about how do these two different explanations fit together? Or do they fit together? And it's really challenging for students. I mean, this is not something that they jump right to. But then they start to realize these two people are talking about entirely different things. What George Bush is saying has no reflection to what Osama bin Laden has sort of presented to the world as his reasons. We then have a writing assignment, a formal take-home writing assignment the students engage with. I call these a primary source of analysis, where they take a primary source and they critique it. And they've done 2 of these during the 4th quarter, during the spring part of the year. They've looked at one with Woodrow Wilson's 14 points, and thinking back to Zach Lockman, they actually look at excerpts from Hitler's Mein Kampf to try to understand how is Hitler trying to appeal to German people. And so they're already used to wrestling with some tough questions a bit here in writing, and then I asked them to analyze why does bin Laden oppose the U.S., and why does he use the language, and then they write this formal analysis. And that's the end. And so they're able to wrestle with this incredibly difficult question, but hopefully from the perspective of historians, And so when everyone was talking this morning on the panel, I'm sitting there listening, I'm going, oh my God, they're saying all the things I'm trying to sort of do. And it really has been wonderful to watch the students wrestle with this. It's not easy, but it helps if you've ramped up to it. It really is a process of a culmination of giving them tools, the analytical tools, the critical thinking skills, and the historical framework to make sense of those events.
So, first of all, thank you all for so eloquently. Really, I basically told them almost nothing, so it's amazing how well spoken all of you are, and I'm really moved actually by all of the things you're doing in the classroom. I always am whenever I let you guys actually speak. I have one question right off the bat that I kind of want to just throw out to the room. The issue of chronology in teaching history has come up several times in different ways, and sort of simultaneously as being the shackles of the textbook that puts you in this frame, and then those of you who break out of it, break into maybe a thematic way of teaching history, experience other issues. Bram, you mentioned that you're teaching this at the end of the year, and I think the tendency, and I think it stems from this urge of memorializing. Aaron, you talked about how it's really the first week of school or the second week of school. So I'm wondering if, I know some of you said when you teach it, but at least 2 of you didn't. How is it better to wait and teach 9/11 out of sequence with the sort of trend of memorializing, or has it worked better for you? Are your students more ready when it's on the sort of official anniversary? It's sort of I think it's actually a provocative question, but
In the spirit of learning through teaching, as I sit here and listen to Bram, I'm thinking, why not do both?
Yeah.
In other words, one can do a lesson at the beginning of the year and then return to it and have students reflect on how their answers to some of these questions might have changed. So I thank you, because I think what I'm going to do is perhaps use it as a bookend from now on. Because I do think it's very valuable.
Can I just add something?
Yeah.
Because I mentioned it briefly in the beginning here, so it's out there and it gets the kids thinking. In my Middle East class, it happens to come in the middle of the year because of the nature of the class. And, students are also coming out of a sort of different sense. And I think, what Mikhail just said, using it more than once. It's such a tough issue for students to wrestle with. There's an advantage to coming back to it. There's an advantage with any issue in history, but I think something that resonates so strongly in New York particularly.
I also say there's a thing called current events that we're always wrestling with too, which is, dropping what you may be doing chronologically to address, what's happening today, and, this is not that, so, there are other times where you do just stop and put in something because it's so important to understand what's happening right now, but that's always a struggle for teachers, because we never do as much of that as we ought to be doing.
Are there any questions or reflections from teachers in the audience? Go ahead, Lauren.
On your question, Greta, about when to do it, last year was a little bit different because it was the 10th anniversary. And I think a lot of people did special stuff on the anniversary day. I'm not sure. I'm not sure if, years from now, if that 9/11 is going to be equally, let's stop and do it.
We were talking a little bit about this over lunch, and I know I mentioned in various times of my career as teaching, I've either taught history chronologically or done more work thematically, and because of all the curriculum you have to get through, preparing students for state tests, preparing them to go out to the world in higher education, it's struggling with how to cover everything, and thematically it's been, especially since we're project-based, we get to develop our own curriculum at my school, which I think is similar to many of you. It's quite freeing to then create these thematic projects. I always wonder with certain things, and 9/11 is one of those topics and events and sort of places of study of whether or not I want to clump it in with something else, or whether it should stand by itself. And that's when the timing becomes important to me, which is much like you were saying, right? I want to acknowledge the day. I want the students to also know I'm acknowledging that day. And then it just depends on whether or not the class, the needs of my students, what might be going on, of whether or not I want to put it with something else, right? Democracy or, other acts of restricting civil liberties, as was talked about this morning, and then putting it in that thematic project base where perhaps we're studying many things or different groups are doing different parts of history. But there are these things, do you use that as the model and put everyone else, with a different topic? Because are there these events that stand alone?
Robbie, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, I'm wondering about the question about linking 9/11 to Iraq and Afghanistan. That you wouldn't teach Pearl Harbor without linking it to World War II. And I'm wondering, you think about, I think even the statistics I read about how, I don't think Afghanistan even made a list of the things that people remember. And George Romney didn't remember it in his convention speech, right? So I'm wondering if people see a need to link that when they teach him, or it's just too much, or I'm wondering how people approach this, because it seems to me that one of the ways that the sort of political significance of 9/11 gets obscured is that it's not connected. It was this one sort of moment where everybody was united, but then nobody, I think that's part of the reason why Iraq is so low in that poll. Who wants to remember? It's like, who wants to remember Vietnam? It's so divisive. And I'm just wondering if people have thought about connecting those when you teach it, or if that just seems like an overload, or how people have dealt with that. Especially since Afghanistan, believe it or not, is still going on.
Well, in my class, it naturally comes up just because of the time of it is, and we talk about U.S., foreign policy in the last 20 years, and so it does become quite obvious to the students. But I think if you do it at the beginning of the year, I can see it would be really difficult. Never would try to link it in that context, because I think the one, as much as I understand the reason we're doing it at the beginning of the year, it does focus more on commemorating that event than, and so linking it to Afghanistan sort of becomes tough to fit into a commemoration.
Oh, by the way, the other thing I should mention is that, especially the Quaker school, that you can flip that over and link it to the whole question of anti-war movements, not just war, but anti-war movements in America, like bird speech or something. That's another, that where do you fit that in too? Because that's also a big.
I think one of the things that enters into that question is do it in the beginning or do it at the end. There's really two different things going on. One is understanding 9/11 as you explain in your 10th grade class, where we really contextualize it, where we really understand the 20th century, America's role, nation states, rise of fundamentalism, all of that stuff, and then read bin Laden, and it comes together and we see what bin Laden says. But none of that really captures the impact that it had on New York. I know it's only 3,000 people, but those towers coming down, that had a psychological slam right in the gut that no amount of context and no amount of understanding what was really on bin Laden's mind can get to. Last year, I asked my history kids on the day we were doing this in a couple of different classes, I asked them to write, how does your family remember 9/11? Because they were in first and second grade at the time. And they didn't know, they didn't really have a clear memory, most of them. But all of them had stories. All of them had been told about it. And they could just ask their mother or their grandmother or their aunt. And, the neighbor next door, and dad was missing, and da-da-da-da. And that was kind of an exercise in history and their own historical creation. And also, I think, exercise in family therapy, as some really harsh emotional moments from their families got captured that didn't do much for putting the context of bin Laden and the attack. But I think there's multiple things going on here.
No, I agree entirely, and I think it goes back to the discussions we came up. What's the goal of a history class?
Yeah.
And you sort of, I think if you can know what you're trying to do, then you sort of, it shapes your approach to teaching 9/11. I just, my approach often is not about that sort of, what in a way almost is sort of therapy. Like, that's not what I'm trying to do, and it's, I know you don't get to that. I mean, that's often where the silence sort of fits in a Quaker classroom, is the time to process that way.
But also, that speaks to the issue of what is war. I mean, what is
Yeah.
war like? I think that's really an important thing for people to, the trauma of being in a war zone is something that is what you're talking about, which I think is really significant.
New York is a war zone? Is that what you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was a war zone.
Yeah, but New York we didn't feel like it was a war zone. We felt like we were civilians.
I felt like I think the most part of history was a war.
Civilians are part of a war.
Yeah.
I felt like I was in a war zone,
Yeah.
walking over the
Yeah.
Williamsburg Bridge with fighter jets
Yeah.
flying and
Yeah.
smoke and debris. I mean, it felt like a war zone.
Well, my joke, sort of a joke in my own mind for this is like, when did 9/11 begin and end? Because, by definition, it's just this one day. 9/11 is 9/11, it was one day, but when did 9/11 begin and end begins to kind of contextualize. You can't ignore that day is what you're looking at, but what's the before and the after? So it's just my way of thinking of it.
Right, and I also think there is value in thinking about doing 9/11 on 9/11, and then doing it with its own unit, standalone unit, later in the year, and thinking about this chronology and thematic debate. I think there's value in also thinking about it just embedding nonfiction articles, embedding 9/11 throughout multiple units. So, for example, if we were going to do a unit on World War II, but you wanted to get the students hooked on the Pearl Harbor and causes of war, then you could use 9/11 as a hook. Or if you want to do the Alien Sedition Act or any other kind of Civil Liberties Act, then you could use the Patriot Act following 9/11 and embed that within the unit. So, and also thinking about skills that we want students to take away too, because we're just thinking about the big takeaways from content, but I think it's also really important to not overlook the skills that we want students to get from history. So thinking about those DBQs that they'll take at the end in a Regents exam, you could get multiple documents on 9/11 and use that as DBQ lesson rather than like worrying about like what unit it goes in or